My name is Ryan Parker. I'm the Chief Legal Product Officer here at SixFifty, and I'm excited to present this webinar. For those of you that may be new to our SixFifty webinars and aren't familiar with SixFifty, we're an HR platform that helps companies to hire and manage employees all across the country. And so we spend a lot of time helping companies to create employee handbooks, talking to our customers about employee handbooks, and we're going to share some of the things that we've learned about employee handbooks as we've worked with these customers today, and we're excited about that. Let me answer a few preliminary questions that we get at all of our webinars, and we'll try to get these out of the way early. First, we'd like this to be an interactive webinar. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom. We have a lot of people on the webinar, and the chat often moves fast and furious, and it's a little bit hard for us to keep track of questions that are in the chat. So if you have a question, put it in the Q&A. We'll try to answer it during the webinar. If we can, we're going to also try to save some time at the end for Q&A if possible. So use that Q&A function. So that you don't have to put these questions in the Q&A, I'll answer a couple of questions we get at every webinar. First, will we get a copy of the slides? Yes, we will send out the slides in a follow-up email after the program. 2, will we get a recording of the webinar? Again, the answer is yes. We'll send you a recording in our follow-up email. 3, are there codes for SHRM, HRCI, and CLE credit? Again, the answer is yes, and we'll give you those credits about 2/3 of the way through the program. We can't send those out afterwards, so please have a pen or pencil ready to write those down so that you can get your SHRM, HRCI, or CLE credit. So with that, I'm going to introduce my co-presenter today. I'm really excited to have Seth Baraney with us today. Seth is a legal product counsel at SixFifty. He helps us both with consumer data privacy issues and employment issues. And Seth has especially been instrumental in the creation of a lot of our separation documents for those SixFifty customers who maybe have used the separation kit. Seth, when he's not working on legal product related issues for us at SixFifty, loves concerts, comedy shows, and I know who he's cheering for this year. He's an Atlanta Braves fan deep in Philadelphia Phillies country. So he's probably a little careful wearing that Braves hat around, but he's got a great squad going for this season. We're really grateful to have Seth on the program today. Let me jump right into the agenda. Looks like, Seth, you're not the only Braves fan. I see several comments there, so you can take heart. But let me jump right into the agenda. We're going to start with employee handbook objectives and structure. We'll just talk about some basics there as we've talked to people about how they structure their handbook and what they want to get out of it. We'll talk about updating your employee handbook and some of the questions we get the most often about how often to send out acknowledgments and how often to make changes. We're going to talk about state handbook requirements, what you should be thinking about as you customize your handbook. And then we'll also talk a little about paid sick leave, which has been a hot area lately. And we'll hit all those and try to save some time for questions as well. So let's jump into our first substantive slide. As I mentioned, we work with a lot of customers on creating employee handbooks. We have an employee handbook engine and an addenda engine, and we work with companies and organizations as they're creating their handbooks. And one of the questions that we often ask is, what do you want to get out of your handbook? What are your goals for your handbook? And we get a lot of different answers. Many of them fall into these 4 buckets. They want an effective resource. We want an effective resource for our employees, a way to establish expectations for our employees, a tool to help us comply with federal, state, and local employment laws, and an instrument for creating and maintaining our organization's culture and values. So I want to just start with a poll question. I'm curious to see, you can actually select multiple of these, but why don't you check the sort of objectives, the main objectives you have for your employee handbook. And I'll be interested to see how these play out because these are 4 that we hear often. I also have something else in there. So if you want to put something else, you can check that and put that into the chat. I'll be interested to hear if there are other things you think about. But let us know kind of what your goals are for your employee handbook. If you're on this webinar, you're obviously thinking about your handbook and something you care about. Let us know kind of what your objectives are there. The reason that I like this question, to start with this question, is because I think our objectives can also help us to sort of think about where we want to put our effort. So let's see what the results are here on our poll. And we'll pull that up here as we finish. Here are our poll results. Interesting. So about 75% of you, 74% said a resource for our employees. 69% said a way to establish expectations. 71% said a tool for complying with employment laws. So those three are high. A little bit lower at 54%, an instrument for establishing and maintaining our organization's culture and values. I think this is pretty consistent with what we've seen. And then 2% said something else. I'm excited to see what those other things are in the chat. Well, thank you for participating in that poll. I want to just sort of talk about why it's important to think about what you want out of your employee handbook. And I'm going to do this relatively quickly because I think this is somewhat basic, but let's look at kind of what you need to do if you want to meet those objectives, right? So if you want your handbook to be a resource for your employees, there's kind of three things you need to be thinking about. Is it easy for my employees to access the handbook? How are you hosting it? How are you providing it to your employees? Is it something that they have easily at their disposal? Is it easy for them to navigate? I remember when I showed up at the Department of Justice for my first day, and they gave me this dusty handbook that had a binder clip and was like 400 pages. It was really difficult to navigate. You know, if I wanted to find something, I'm flipping through the pages. The last thing is it easy for employees to read and understand? And I think that's important. It's really, I think, common for organizations to have handbooks that are chock full of legalese and difficult to understand language. So if you want it, and the example that I often think about for myself, I remember, again, when I was at the Department of Justice, I got a jury summons, and I thought, what do I do with a jury summons? Do we have jury duty leave? And I tried to figure it out. I ended up having to go to my HR manager and ask. You know, I think you want your employees to be able to, you know, if they get that jury summons, be able to look in your handbook and figure out, oh, we have jury duty leave. Here's what I need to do. You know, and you can walk through those things. It can be a helpful resource for them in that regard. So remember, easy to access, easy to navigate, easy to read and understand. Okay, next. If your goal is that you want your handbook to establish employee expectations, one thing you might need to think about is including more than just required policies. We sometimes get customers that come to us that want to create an employee handbook, and they're kind of in a hurry, and they just say, I just want the required policies. And that's not a bad way to go, especially if you're going from zero to having an employee handbook. But if you really want it to establish employee expectations, you probably need more than just those required policies. And this may require you to know about your employee, your organization culture, and the issues that are arising. And these are some policies that a lot of our customers have been adding, or at different times have asked about. You know, a code of conduct, social media. If you have an employee who gets on social media and starts posting things about your company, and then you have to call them in, it's so much easier if you have a social media policy that's laid out exactly what those expectations are, and then you can hold them to the expectations. Same thing with outside employment, pets in the workplace. We actually, at the end of, I know the pandemic, I'm not sure, I don't want to say the end, but as the pandemic started to wane and people went back to the office, a lot of people had loved working with their pets, and we had several organizations reach out and say, people are bringing their pets into our office and we don't know what to do about it. If you have a pets in the workplace policy, your employees can figure out for themselves and understand your expectations. Employee dating, marijuana are other ones we get a lot of questions about. And so if you want to be able to set expectations and hold your employees to those expectations, it's important to think about what policies maybe that aren't required you want to put into your handbook. And I have been in depositions with employees who were let go for various reasons. And I have seen, and I have asked the question, are you aware that the company had this policy in their handbook? And it's a powerful way to protect yourself when it comes to both setting and maintaining expectations. Okay, next objective. So on our next slide, do you want your employee handbook to help establish and maintain your organization's culture? And this is one actually that was not as high. It's interesting. I would say this has been declining in the last couple of years. There was a time where I think this was a really high objective, and I think it still can be important. especially for companies that have remote employees. A lot of what employees pick up about culture happens in an office space. And if you're not at the office, some organizations look for other ways to establish their culture. And I think a handbook can be that. That's something, if your employees are looking at, something that shows them what you value. And so a mission statement, your values, maybe a history, and then policies that reflect those values. If you say, hey, we're a company that really values kind of people having a work-life balance and being able to bring their best self to work, but also take time off, and then you don't really have leave policies, those things can feel discordant, and employees recognize that quickly. So make sure that you have not only sort of statements, mission statements, values, but also policies that reflect those values. Okay, let's jump to our last one, and this is one that we'll talk about a little bit more. But if you want your employee handbook to help you comply with federal, state, and local employment laws, and this is one that a lot of people said was an objective for them, there's a couple things that you really need to know, and this has become more important than ever, I think. How many employees do you have? And that's important because a lot of these employment laws have employee count thresholds. So it's important, if you're at 48 employees, for you to know when you hit 50 or when you go over 25. Those thresholds are important, and you need to understand what they are, and you need to keep track of how many employees you have. This one is crucial. You need to know where each of your employees work. This became a huge issue over the pandemic when people were working remotely. I heard so many stories from our customers and from others of employees moving to different states, not telling their employer, and then the employer hasn't been paying the required taxes or making contributions to workers' compensation insurance or other things like that. And it really can cause some big problems for your employee. Maybe your employee moved to Montana and now you don't have an at-will employment relationship with them. So you really need to know where your employees work, because where your employees work typically determines which state laws govern your employment relationship. And so you need to keep track of that. That's why I think an employee relocation policy is one of the most important policies you can have in your handbook. Your employees need to understand that if they're going to move, they need to let you know, and that you have a say in whether their employment will continue, and you can base that on which state they're going to live in. There are employers out there who have limitations on where people can move, and those limitations can really only be enforced effectively if you have an employee relocation policy. And some companies have it, some don't, but man, is it important. I will say, I talked to a friend of mine. He was actually at a law firm. They had an employee during the pandemic move to Africa, to an African country, and work there for over a year without telling the law firm. And you wonder if these things are true, but I've heard so many of these stories, and I think it's really important that organizations have this policy. The last thing is, you need to figure out which policies are required for each of your locations. Again, where your employees work, that's really the place that's going to govern your employment relationship. And so if you have, for example, employees in California, you're going to need to make sure that you're meeting the California standards, that they're getting the different kinds of training they need, like workplace violence prevention, sexual harassment prevention training, all the required trainings. And so you have to keep track of that. And so if you want your handbook to really be a resource, you need to make sure that you're thinking about the requirements in each of the states where you have employees. Okay, so now that we've thought about what we want our employee handbook to do and how we're going to get there, let's talk a little bit about how to structure an employee handbook. And this is interesting. I think most of you probably already have employee handbooks. You probably have one that falls into these 4 categories. These are the 4 main categories that we see people ask about. But I want you to think about whether the format that you have serves your company best. So let's go through these. I've given them names. I'm sure there are other ways to classify these, but the first I call an all-in-one, all of your policies for all of your states where you have employees in one handbook. So your sick leave policy is going to have a Maryland, a Virginia, a Delaware, and a West Virginia policy. And they're just right next to each other, and they're different, and they're all in one handbook. This is often one used by, if you're only in one state, this is probably what you have. A core well, next I'm going to go to universal. This is an increasingly popular option. This is where companies actually create sort of policies that comply with the requirements in all of the states that they're in, or maybe all of the states across the country, so they don't have to add a lot when they hire in new states. And this allows you to have a little shorter handbook. It has some drawbacks. We'll talk about pros and cons, but this universal policy where you sort of try to be generous enough that you meet the requirements of in every state is an increasingly popular option. This is probably the one I'm seeing the most often, which is core plus addenda. It's where you have sort of core policies that don't have state-specific information, and then you have an addenda at the end with state-specific information from all of the states that you're in. And that's an interesting way of doing it. You sort of have, you know, the core of what your handbook has, and then your state-specific information at the end. And then interestingly, I've seen a number of companies and organizations that have employees in a lot of different states use a separate handbook model where they actually just have a separate handbook for each of the states they're in. They send that handbook out to their employees in those different states. So I want to talk about the pros and cons to each of these handbooks. But before I do that, I want to throw up a poll question and just see what kind of employee handbook you have. I'm interested to see the answer. I think that these numbers have moved a little over the last couple of years, but I'm very interested to see, check which one you have, all-in-one, universal, core handbook plus addenda, separate handbooks, maybe a type not listed above, or if you don't have a handbook, this is a safe space. Let us know what you have. It'll be interesting to see how this breaks out. I have some guesses, but I haven't been known to be wrong. So we'll give you just a second. Let us know what type of handbook you have, and then we'll talk through the pros and cons. Okay, we'll give you just another second here to answer the poll question. And let's see what we've got here. I'm really curious to see our responses. Okay. Oh, interesting spread. So about 36%, a little more than a third, have an all-in-one handbook. 17% with a universal handbook. Another third, about 35%, with a core handbook plus addenda. That's, I think, an option that I've seen growing in popularity. Only 7% with separate handbooks. I think there's some good reasons for that. Type not listed above, only 2%. So I guess I did a pretty good job of creating the buckets. And then only 4% we don't have a handbook. So that's great. You're thinking about a handbook. You're here at the webinar. I hope that this is a discussion that can help you as you're thinking about a handbook. Really great, interesting spread. We'll talk about the pros and cons of each of these. Let's jump into the next slide, and we'll go through this as you're thinking about this. So let's talk about the all-in-one. I think we had 37% of our respondents have an all-in-one handbook. And that's sort of the traditional model of a handbook. It's relatively easy to navigate. You have all your policies sort of in the core, and it can be somewhat easy to maintain. The cons are that it can get pretty long. As you get employees in new states, if that's sort of the way that your organization works, those all-in-one handbooks can get very long. You know, another drawback, and I put this as a con, this is a point of discussion that we've had internally and with others. Employees in different states can compare benefits. I think some people would actually say that that's a pro. I'm a pro-transparency person, so I don't necessarily think that's a con, but I have had a lot of organizations say that it causes problems when employees are looking and they think, oh, I live in Arizona, but if I just moved across the border to California, I would get more leave. And they have issues there. And so they don't like employees being able to compare, for example, leave policies across states. So that can be, I think, a con to the all-in-one. Universals. Universal handbooks, I think, are interesting. They can help a handbook be short because you've sort of set policy levels so that they apply to all your states. You don't have to have a lot of state-specific information. They treat employees in different states uniformly, so you don't have to worry about comparison or other issues. The cons are that you're likely giving some employees more benefits than they are entitled to under state law. And I'm all for being generous with employees, but I think that is a serious consideration, right? As your organization, can you afford to give your employees in Arkansas the same amount of leave that you give your employees in California, right? I mean, there are big differences, or even Idaho and California, right? If you're a Western company, there's some big differences there. And so there's a cost that comes with, providing the same benefits all across the board. Core handbook with addenda, it does allow for a shorter core, which I think is kind of nice. You can get to the core policies quickly. It's relatively easy to update. If you add someone in a new state, you can actually typically just add a new section to your addenda, which is nice and makes it easy to update rather than having to go in and sort of tweak each individual policy in your handbook. So that's why I think I've seen a lot of companies that have a large remote footprint that use this core plus addenda model, because it really does allow you to quickly update a handbook when you've got people in new states. The cons are that it actually, I think, can be somewhat tough to navigate in some instances, in that you may have employees that are having to flip back and forth between your core handbook and your addenda to figure out how much leave they get or what policies apply to them. And I think, that's not ideal. Separate handbooks, we only had 7% say separate handbooks. I think it can be the right option in certain situations. It can keep your handbook shorter, right? You just have that one state. You don't have your employees comparing leave with other states. I think one of the cons can be that it can be a big administrative burden, right? If you're in 15 states and you're having to keep 15 handbooks up to date instead of one, I think there's an administrative burden there. And I think you have this sort of transparency, whether that's a pro or a con there. So that's some of the pros and cons that I've seen with these different handbooks. I hope that's helpful as you're thinking about both how your handbook is structured and how you may want to change its structure in the future. I will say that I think there are a lot of handbook tools that make changing the structure relatively easy. We have one handbook engine that can help you to create handbooks in any of these sort of 4 structures, and you just sort of answer and choose as you go along. And that's the way that we do it. And I think there are lots of tools that can help make either switching or creating a new handbook in one of these different formats relatively easy. I want to turn now to handbook updates. This is probably the question, well, a couple questions we get the most often. Why don't we jump to the next slide here? A couple of years ago, I was doing a employee handbook webinar, and I inadvertently said that people should update their handbook every month. And I have never seen the chat get so angry. I'll tell you what, people got out the pitchforks. They were upset with me. What I really meant was, I really think that as a best practice, you should review your employee handbook every month for possible updates. You don't need to update it, but I do think that there's some real value to staying on top of it. I'm a person that really thinks that a little effort each month saves a lot of effort at the end of the year. And the other benefit is, if you have a big change in the law, say you update your handbook in January, you have a change in the law in March, your handbook is out of date for 9 months because you wait till January to change it, right? If you just make little changes as they occur, then your handbook is always up to date, and you never have that dreaded time at the beginning of January where you're like, oh, shoot, now I have to go back and look at 12 months of legal changes and try to put them all into my handbook. And so I really think the best practice is to review every month, consider changes to the laws. That's the one we often think about, but also changes to your footprint, right? Have you hired someone in a new state? Or have you had someone from maybe you separated from an employee that was the only employee in the state, or maybe they moved, so you're no longer in a state. If that's the case, you can also pull policies and language out of your handbook. And then your employee count, right? Have you hit 50 employees? And so you need to be thinking about the FMLA. Have you hit 15 employees in a jurisdiction where that's a threshold for a type of leave that you need to be thinking about? Keep that in mind. I really do. Again, I can't emphasize enough. A little time each month, I think, can make a big difference. And then hopefully you never have to have that big slog of going through and updating your entire handbook. I'll just give you an example. We send out an update every month. And it's interesting, January is always a big month. A lot of things change January 1st. June, actually July 1st is kind of the new January. You get a lot of changes in July. And a lot of people think, well, nothing happens in between. Actually not true. So this is from the update we got in February. As you can see, the U.S. Department of Labor put out some clarifications on the interplay between PTO and FMLA. You have Indiana updating its teen work hour poster. So if you're in Indiana, Massachusetts, and this is just a snapshot of kind of our update that we send out. Even in months like February that are not traditionally heavy months for changes, there's a lot of things that change, and it's nice to be able to keep up to date with those. The final thing I want to talk about is acknowledgments. This is an issue that we get a lot of questions about. How often do I need to have employees acknowledge or sign the handbook? It's such a pain. It's so hard. When do I do it? What do I, if it's only this kind of change, do I do it? Or do I only do it for that kind of change? I'll give you some of my basic thoughts, but I think this is an important one. First of all, just as a preliminary matter, you need to understand that your employee handbook is not a contract. In fact, your employee handbook should say in it, this is not a contract. It is not creating a contractual relationship. And so I think a lot of times people are like, no, but I need them to sign it as if it's a contract. It's not a contract. So kind of keep that in mind as you're thinking about what acknowledgments or signatures do. The value of those acknowledgments is that when you call an employee in and say, listen, we understand that you have outside employment and that outside employment has been affecting your ability to do your work for us. Are you aware that we have an outside employment program? And if they say no, you can say, well, you acknowledged the handbook. We've sent this out to you. This is and we expect you to meet these expectations. It's really about setting expectations. And so here are a couple of different approaches that I think all work for different organizations. And I think you should figure out what works best for you. Some organizations, and these are typically organizations that have a good tool for sending out acknowledgments. We're actually creating an acknowledgement tool right now that I think will make this an easy process. And for those that have a tool like that, where you just send it out, they have the new handbook, they acknowledge that they've received it and read it by clicking a button, and then you store that. That's maybe an easy way to send out for acknowledgement every time there's a significant change. Now, if you're fixing a typo or changing the graphics, I don't think you need to send it out. But if you're putting in a new policy, for example, Michigan's got their sick leave policy is potentially changing dramatically in a couple of days. And I think Seth's going to talk about that. If you change that policy, it might be nice for you to get an acknowledgement from your Michigan employees, because sick leave is a significant policy that people think a lot about. Another way that I've seen organizations handle this is they make employees aware of changes as they occur. So they'll send out maybe on a, if they have people in a lot of states, they're making changes every month, they might send out a monthly email just saying, here's the things we've changed in the handbook, but they're only getting an acknowledgement once a year. Maybe in January, they send out the handbook for acknowledgement, but they're sending out emails explaining changes as they come. I think that puts you in a strong position to be able to show that your employees are aware of what's in your handbook and that they know those expectations and that they need to meet them without having to sort of get signatures every time. I think that's an interesting option. I have seen some organizations where they make employees aware of changes as they occur, but they only get acknowledgements when the employee starts. So they send out the handbook, they say, we want you to acknowledge this, that you've received the handbook, and then they just send updates. And I don't think that puts you in as strong a position as the other options, but I still think you've got a strong record that people have acknowledged that there is a handbook and they're getting correspondence and communication about changes. So think about what works best for you. Remember, it's not a contract. It's really about making sure that your employees have the handbook and that they are aware of the expectations that it creates in case you need to have difficult conversations with them. I think that's really where these acknowledgements sort of come into play the most often. So we've covered a lot of ground. Those are some of the basics. I'm now going to kick it over to Seth, who's going to talk about a number of other handbook related issues.
Thanks, Brian. So we're going to start on our next slide here with the biggest question we get probably from anybody. And Ryan's already talked about it a little bit because it does kind of permeate the whole concept of a handbook, right? Which is which state laws govern your employment relationships. And as Ryan said, there's a general rule that we use most of the time because it's going to get you 95% of the way there. And that is just the law of the state where the employee works, right? And I do mean works there, notably not necessarily lives. Just as a kind of an illustration, right? 650 is based in Utah, whereas I work in, or I live in Pennsylvania, kind of near Philadelphia. But I'm right on that border of New Jersey, right? And I work from home the whole time. So in our case, it would be Pennsylvania law that applies. But let's say, it's not out of the question that I might, reserve space in a co-working area or some kind of like common shared office space that might be in New Jersey. And in that case, if I end up going into New Jersey 5 days a week, even though I live in Pennsylvania, you might have the law of New Jersey apply to that relationship, which kind of comes back to another thing Ryan was mentioning, which is relocation policies being pretty important here. Just to make sure that you understand where all your employees are living. And even more specifically, it might be a good idea to include a requirement that they tell you where they're working, or that you check up on remote work employees every so often to say, hey, are you working from home the whole time? Are you leaving? You're going somewhere else? Because that can just be good for you to know which laws you kind of have to deal with. And I want to take a second to muddy the waters, as lawyers like to do, but just to kind of focus a little bit on that it depends, on that 5 or 10% that this rule doesn't quite get you there. And that is that there can be circumstances where it's not clear where the employee performs most of their work, right? I think the most common example of this would be in kind of partial or return to work type circumstances where I'm starting to get employees back in the office where before we let them work from home 5 days a week, maybe we want to have them start coming in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, right? If you live near a place, if you live near the border of several states, there's a decent chance some of your employees might have lived in these other states and now they're having to commute in to the office in a hybrid part, right? 2 days a week, 3 days a week. And then can you just say it's where they perform most of their work? Probably. I think that tends to be the approach that we see most courts take is, if there's 4 days in Pennsylvania, 1 day in New Jersey, it's probably going to be Pennsylvania. But be aware that that is not always going to be the case. And unfortunately, this issue of choice of law can be extremely complicated. And if it gets to a court, in these kind of hybrid situations, it is hard to say where they're going to go. They might end up going with and saying, even though it's only 1 day a week in New Jersey, we think that one applies for X, Y, and Z. So you want to be aware that when you have those complicated situations that you might want to kind of focus on them a little bit more, and maybe a safe way to handle those situations is to try and create your relationships with these employees in a way that complies with both of the states that are potentially at issue, right? So Pennsylvania, New Jersey, if you're not sure, maybe make sure that whatever types of leave are required in either state are available to this employee. Any required policies are available in both states, which again can be a bit of a headache, but it's kind of this whole thing, right? And I think the upside of it obviously is that being this flexible, right, and allowing your employees to kind of work and live where they want to opens up your access to a lot more of a diverse pool of talent, right? And in a kind of increasingly competitive employment market like that, it can be good to have that little bit of an edge. So that's that. On the next slide, I have a couple kind of practical tips for you here. The next slide, I think we went back there. There we go. Just a couple practical tips, which are really kind of what we have already talked about, which is just make sure you know where your employees live and work. And having a formal relocation policy is great there. And for smaller operations, I think even just kind of having communication channels open with these employees can be a good way to do it. Just so your HR folks can be talking to them periodically, making sure you know where they live and work. And then the other thing is obviously make sure your handbook complies with the law of every state where you have employees. And you really, like I was saying, you want to err on the side of caution here, and you want to include any state that could possibly be somewhere that the law would be applied to your employees, just to make sure you cover all your bases. And I think that's one of the reasons that we're seeing a universal approach to handbooks and policies become more common, right? Because if you do comply with the strictest rule in the United States for everyone, then you don't necessarily need to worry about juggling all of these different state requirements and trying to apply them to all these different employees. And there are some circumstances which I'll get into in a minute, where that's not always possible, right? Because some states require specific things that aren't really susceptible to this kind of lowest common denominator type approach. But in general, a lot of things are. A lot of the sick leave, a lot of the bereavement leave, a lot of the payment rules can be reduced to just, whatever's the strictest requirement everybody gets to follow. But, what do? How do you keep up with all that stuff? I think really the most important kind of practical tip we can give on that front is to just find a resource or some resources that help you track changes in the law. Because when you're dealing with 50 states and even more municipalities that are passing laws whenever they want to, that aren't being very thoroughly covered by the media, you really need to kind of know where you're going for truth so that you can build a handbook and kind of feel confident that you're complying with every one of these laws. And there's a bunch of resources you can use, but I'm going to take a moment here and show you one of the tools that we have at SixFifty, which we call our research platform. And this is a place where we can, let's see here. Basically, this is somewhere you can go in, and let's say you have, you're just going to hire a new employee in Colorado, right? You've never had to deal with Colorado before. And so you want to know what kind of maybe leave policies do I need to add to my handbook to make sure that we're compliant with Colorado law. So you can pop in here, select Colorado. If you happen to know they're in a specific municipality, you can also select that too, but we won't here. And then you can come on down and we break it down by topic. And here we want to know all the different types of leave. And then it'll break down into all the subtopics. And here you see entries for each type of leave in Colorado. So if you were, trying to deal with this employee, you could look through each of these and say, okay, we make sure that it complies with, that we have a policy for all of these different types of leave. And just to give you a sense of what it kind of looks like, here we have a little summary of what the requirement does up top, and then breaks down kind of the specific requirements: who has to take the leave, is it paid, what are the possible uses for the leave, and then that comes with a citation. So if you want to kind of check the statute yourself, you can do that. Another little neat thing we have in here is sometimes you come in and you want to see sick leave, but you might not necessarily know that there's other types of leave that would allow an employee to take them when they're sick. Right. And so for that, and we kind of will put in a signpost here that says, so in this case, Colorado has normal sick leave, but they also require a bonus, like little chunk of sick leave in the event of a public health emergency. So then we'll link you to the research center or the research article that kind of talks about that specific leave. And it's not just, let's say in another circumstance, you have an employee in Colorado that you kind of haven't checked up on in a while. You haven't been keeping up on Colorado law maybe as much as you should have. So this is where those legal updates Ryan was talking about are going to come in handy here. So you can do the same kind of thing. Just click legal updates. We want to have them all for Colorado. By default, it's going to be sorted by the date we put them out by most recent. So you can just scroll through here and say, okay, they increased the non-competition salary threshold. If I have a non-compete with my Colorado employees, I got to check and make sure this new rule or they're making at least this amount, right? Or we have minimum wage increases in all these areas, or all my Colorado employees making at least the minimum wage, or an update to its required posters, So it's a good way to kind of, whether you want to come at it from new employees dealing with these requirements or existing ones where you kind of want to keep up, it's just a nice, easy way to get at a lot of information that would be kind of hard to find elsewhere. What do we mean when we say a policy is required by law, right? Both Ryan and I have said it a lot recently, and I'm going to say it a little bit more here in the next few slides when I get to sick leave. Most of the time, when we say that, what we mean is that there's some law that imposes like a substantive requirement on employers that they have to follow with respect to some employees, right? And think about most types of leave are a really good example of this. Like you have to have, when we say there's a sick leave requirement in most cases, what that means is you have to provide a certain amount of sick leave time to all employees in a given state, right? You don't necessarily have to have a handbook policy in order to comply with these sorts of laws, right? So in these circumstances, we say required policy, we really mean required, like substantive requirement for which a policy is often an effective way to kind of make sure you comply with that requirement. And I think most of these policies are going to be, or most of the times where you're going to want a policy in these types of situations are where you have a law that like requires something that it's important for your employees to have knowledge of in order to kind of comply, right? So again, coming back to leave, the reason we would say that that's a required policy as opposed to just a requirement is it's like your employees need to know what leave is available in order to take it, right? So it's kind of, you're going to have to communicate that with them somehow. And so it kind of makes the most sense there to have a leave policy in your handbook that goes over all this stuff. Use kind of some other examples of similar types of requirements where, ADA policies you have to provide disability accommodations. And so, laying out the process you want employees to use there is a great way to make sure that you comply with it. Overtime, employees want to know what overtime is available and when they'll get it, expense reimbursement, that kind of thing. Kind of on the flip side, there might be some requirements that don't necessarily lend themselves to policies. A lot of states have specific rules for how you pay out employees on separation. They either like the timing when you have to have them paid by, whether you have to pay out vacation, sort of things like that. And, you could have a policy about that if you wanted. It certainly wouldn't be a problem, but it's not necessarily helpful if that makes sense, because as long as your HR, the people handling your payroll, know about the payroll requirements in each state, you can comply with that without really needing to signal that to your employees. So you can probably cut that out of the handbook, right? Save a little bit of space and just kind of make sure that your HR payroll folks are trained on that requirement. And that's generally what we mean when we say required policy. Now, lately, it's becoming increasingly common to have a second kind of requirement where the law specifically requires you to have a written policy separate and apart from actually doing whatever it is that the law says you have to do. So sexual harassment trainings is a good example of this, where there's a lot of laws that are coming out and requiring you to provide certain training to employees about sexual harassment and potentially restrict different types of behavior. They're also specifically requiring you to have a written policy in your handbook that is provided to employees that includes kind of X, Y, and Z. And it's important to note the difference there is that you can potentially be liable and face fines or lawsuits or what have you, even if you're complying with everything the law makes you do, if you don't have the policy. Right? You can be giving the training to everybody who needs to get it. You can be providing lactation accommodations in the case of the California example there. You can only be drug testing legally in Boulder, but you could still get into legal trouble by not having it all written down in the specific way that the state wants you to do. And so that's something that's important to kind of keep abreast of as well. When you're seeing new changes in the law and you're seeing people talk about, oh, this new policy is required, key in and see what they mean by that. Do they mean that you just have to comply, or do they mean that you have to have a written specific policy and you have to comply? There's no way to kind of guarantee or to easily tell like which new laws or where are these going to come from. But I will say, just as a little bit of a kind of pattern I've seen, I think we're a lot more likely to see these types of specific requirements come out of big municipalities like Chicago, your San Franciscos, your California cities, your Denvers, your Boulders, and or more left-leaning state governments that like to kind of get in the weeds of regulation a little bit more. Again, Colorado, California, Illinois, New York, those kinds of places. But you never know. So you want to keep an eye on it, kind of regardless of where you are. And I have an example for you on the next slide, just so you can see a little bit of what these requirements look like. So this is Chicago's requirement for all employees in the city to have a written policy against sexual harassment. And it has to have all these things in it. And they get pretty specific, right? You have to have the specific definition of sexual harassment that is outlined in Chicago's municipal code, right? You can't just define it generally. You need to have an explanation of how employees can report the sexual harassment, a whole process. And you need instructions on how to make it confidential. You can't just have instructions on how to do it generally, right? And so, this is a bit of a potential minefield because of how granular these requirements get. And also, I think because they're one of the areas where kind of a universal policy won't work, right? Because you can have them for these just substantive requirements we were talking about before, like leave, for example. If you just have a policy that provides the highest amount of sick leave required by any state in the country and lets people use it whenever they want, you're gonna comply with the substance of that rule. But you can't do that if a bunch of states have really specific and granular things that they want you to include in a written policy, right? Because you can't get the lowest common denominator of just like a bunch of specific written requirements like that. So even when you're taking the universal approach, which I think shaves off a lot of the hard work of compliance, you still have to kind of keep an eye out for one-off or unique kind of requirements like this. So that's kind of a quick talk about required policies. Last piece I have here for you is paid sick leave. We're going to talk about just some trends in there. And we don't have too much time left. So if you want to get really in depth on all types of leave, not just sick and not just kind of in a trends direction, we're going to have another webinar next Thursday that goes over all the different types of leave and some changes in that law that you can look at for 2025. And I believe there will be a link in the chat and on maybe on one of the slides later that you can use to register for that. But I'll talk some about paid sick leave in the meantime. Really big trend, maybe the biggest one in state employment law over the past several years is states requiring employers to provide sick leave, right? So you have 15 states plus DC with affirmative requirements for specifically sick leave. And then you also have this increasing trend of paid leave for any reason, which is required in 3 states and some localities right now. And as a result of that, you have this interesting statistic that 81% of US employees have access to paid sick leave, even though less than half the states actually require it. And I think that's indicative of the fact that even if it's not mandatory, it's kind of required by the market, because otherwise you're going to have a hard time attracting talent, because these people are going to want to go to an organization that does provide them with paid leave. So even if you aren't in a state that's requiring you to have it, it might be a good idea to provide it anyway. Which I think is something a lot of employers are already doing, given that number there. So, moving into some specific changes that we're seeing in the new year. These are some that just happened on January 1st. You see Washington expanded the uses of that you could spend your sick leave on, including some like emergency leave, like we saw in Colorado, and expanding the definition of family member, right? Because some of these laws, they kind of let you take it for kin care. It's like, I want to take time off because my mom is sick or something. They've expanded that in Washington. New York is requiring prenatal care specifically, so like a bonus pot of leave for pregnant employees. Connecticut is making it apply to more employers, so taking that threshold down from 50 to 25. And California, it's not quite sick leave, but it could be, is expanding their crime victim leave to include more types of uses and things that could theoretically kind of look similar to the kin care and the sick leave that we're talking about. So if you're in any of those states, you got to already be complying with that one, so you want to be aware. On the next slide, we have some new laws that are coming in over this next year, and one of which we have very late movement on, as Ryan alluded to in his piece. But basically, I won't bore you with the details of the back and forth, but essentially there was a voter initiative to amend the Michigan Earned Sick Time Act to basically make it apply to everybody instead of just 50 employees, or instead of only businesses with 50 employees. That ended up getting amended, and now a court is saying that you can't amend that change. And so theoretically, this expansion of Michigan sick leave will go into effect on Friday, but just for drama's sake, the governor and the Michigan legislature are working on kind of a last-minute compromise bill that would essentially kick this date out into July. Last I had heard, that had not yet been passed, but I think they're probably talking about it as we speak right now. So if you are in Michigan, you want to be aware, kind of keep an eye on that, because if nothing happens, then starting this Friday, every employer in Michigan needs to be providing sick leave. If it gets kicked, then you'll probably have a few more months, at least until July or June. But I think and I'm prognosticating here, I think it's going to happen at some point sooner or later. So kind of keep an eye on that as we move forward. In May, you see, I guess, well, we can kind of talk about these 3 laws similarly, I think. So you have ones in Missouri and Alaska and Nebraska, which are going to be brand new sick leave requirements that we just didn't have before. And I think it's notable here because you can look and see that Missouri and Alaska are kind of following what I would say is the closest thing we have to a standard model for sick leave. This accrual of 1 hour for 30 hours worked is pretty common. And you're also seeing this kind of tiered like cap on how much sick leave has to be provided, where smaller employers are limited to around 40 and larger employers go higher. 56 is pretty reasonable. Some states go up to like 80 or what have you. But I think we're going to be seeing this as kind of the mass-produced sick leave law that the rest of the states are going to pass in the next 5 years or so. So really keep an eye on that and make sure you understand kind of accrual versus front loading and how that works for your business and kind of what you want to do. Nebraska's is a little bit different, but it's even, as you can see, it's pretty similar. You have that same 45-56 difference in cap depending on employer size. But you do see an interesting limit, which is that it doesn't apply to people who work less than 80 hours in Nebraska. And you'll see that in some other states as well. And moving into the last thing I have for you, just to kind of talk about some philosophies around creating, in this case, a sick leave policy, but you can kind of apply that to any type of policy, especially, the leaves. You have your universal, which you can really do to, again, that's that lowest common denominator approach. It's going to produce the simplest policy, because we offer both of these types. Our universal policies are usually like 5 or 6 paragraphs, or for the simple ones, because they just kind of provide the most possible leave to everybody, right? Easier to maintain, easier to read, technically costs you money, though, because you have to provide more leave than is maybe necessary to some employees. And the flip side of that is state specific, where you really go through and you say, okay, California employees, you get all the leave in the world because that's what California does. And then Missouri employees, you get sort of the minimum amount. And then other states get whatever else you are entitled to. It makes sure that you only provide as much as you have to, which is certainly cost effective and all that. But I think it can become really, really labor intensive to maintain when you have employees in a lot of states. Right. It's easy to do 2, it's easy to do 3, but if you start getting into 5, 10, 20 different states with different employees, then you can have a situation where you functionally need 20 different leave policies. And sometimes you can kind of combine the language and create a policy that applies to all 10 of your states, but isn't universal. But in a lot of cases, there are just unique, and like a state will do something silly and different than all the other states do, and then you'll have to find a way to incorporate that into your policy. So it can just become a lot of maintenance and a lot of work, but really it's going to be up to you to decide what works best for your organization. And with that, I think I kick it back to Ryan here to bring us home.
Thank you, Seth. Lots of great information there. We've also had a ton of questions. We've had Josh Baca, one of our legal product counsel, answering those questions, but I do want to just touch on a couple of issues that were raised. One of the interesting questions was when it comes to employee thresholds, if a threshold says 5 employees in California, for example, 5 employees, for example, does that mean 5 employees in California or 5 total? And I'm going to answer that. We popped up another poll question for those that would be interested in a no pressure free demo of our product. Click yes, we'll have someone reach out and schedule something. But I do want to answer that question because I think it's a tricky one. It depends. Some state laws are really good at saying this only applies when you have 5 employees in New York. Others will say this applies if you have 5 employees, and you're left trying to decide whether that means 5 employees in New York or 5 employees in total. What we do typically is, I think the more risk averse conservative approach is to say that that's 5 employees total, but it's not very helpful when state legislatures leave us in the lurch that way. And I think that can be a tricky question. So great question that we got there about employee thresholds. Let me just also, before I get to another question, plug our webinar that will be next Thursday, a week from tomorrow. We'll be doing the webinar with our friends at SHRM, and you can register. It's a free webinar here. It's Designing Leave Policies, Modern Strategies for Multi-State Teams. And I think that's going to be really a great presentation about, some of the challenges that organizations face when they have employees in multiple states and they're thinking specifically about leave. Seth did a really nice job of touching on that briefly today, and I will go into great detail on that on Thursday. Let me jump in and we'll just answer a couple more questions just because we have another minute or two. And I was inclined maybe not to touch this question because it's a hot button one, but we did get a question. What should we do about our DEI and immigration policies? This is a tricky time for DEI and immigration policies. And I think that what I would recommend is looking at them closely. It's a great question. I would look at them closely to make sure with regard to immigration policies that you have all of your I-9s and you have your process in place and that you're ready for an audit if that were to come. I think that's always a good idea. When it comes to DEI, I think you want to take a close look at those policies based on the enforcement guidance that we're getting from the new administration and make sure that you're keeping yourself in a safe posture. And I think It's a great question. I think a lot of people have that. It's a hard one to answer in short order, but I did want to acknowledge it. I thought it's a well thought out question. I do think it's an important time to review those policies. And with regard to your DEI council policies, it might be a good thing to do with council.
Yeah, so I'll just bounce off that a little bit. One thing I think is a good piece of advice is, you don't need to dismiss with the idea of DEI, but really what this administration is targeting are explicitly race-based DEI policies and programs. So I think the daylight to keep doing this and avoid enforcement action is to try to think about diversity as a more holistic kind of concept, where you'd focus on an applicant's experiences and their past jobs and that kind of thing. And then that is you're trying to diversify that more than you are a specific racial background or gender or what have you.
Yeah, I agree completely with Seth. I think that that's a good way to think about it, is that you're looking for, I guess policies that look for a diversity of experience are a great way of thinking about that. I will say, though, that this is a difficult issue that is evolving quickly, and we'll likely address it in future webinars, but I think Seth's suggestion there is an excellent one. Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and we've got a whole bunch of good ones here. There's one question here about policy length. We sometimes get folks that say, oh, my handbook is too long. And I just want to acknowledge, we had some people say, well, one way you can address that is by hosting it online. I know that's something that we're coming out with, the ability to do that in the next few weeks here, sort of an opportunity to host. And I think when handbooks are hosted online, when you have an online hosting option, the length, it is not so much of an issue because it's easier to move between policies. And I think that's one way that you can sort of negate some of the frustration of having a really long handbook. I get that. I've worked at places where I had a handbook that was really long and it seemed cumbersome and not very accessible. So I do think that online options are a great way to do that, because I think while you want to be able to have language that's concise, you also need to have everything in there. And so that's a tough balancing act. Seth, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think I like what you said about the hosting it, kind of clearing some of that issue. I think really the philosophical backing behind that is thinking about a handbook not as something that someone sits down and reads through, but more as like a reference document where, and having a good, effective table of contents that's linked, and you can easily use to say, I want to know where the leave policies are, and you click leave and you go down. And that way, you're not thinking about it like somebody's going to sit here and read all 400 of these pages. You just want to make it easy for them to find what they need in there.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Well, we're at the top of the hour. We got a ton of great questions. I wish we could keep answering them. I think we've tried to answer as many as we can. Josh has been answering those, but thank you so much for joining us for this 650 webinar. We've really enjoyed having you. We appreciate your participation. We hope you've enjoyed the program and that you'll join us for a future 650 webinar, maybe even the one week from tomorrow on sick leave. But in the meantime, have a great week. Stay warm. Enjoy the beginning of spring baseball. And again, we hope to see you again on another 650 webinar.